So the, the question that was raised with me was about how has the church responded to um, pandemics in the past. I can't do 1918 at all because I know nothing about 1918. But let me just start with where I used to start church history 2 when I taught seminarians. And I always started that semester with a brief writing um, opportunity in which I had them read Whether One May Flee the Plague, which was written by Martin Luther in 1527. And he wrote that in response to an outbreak of the bubonic plague in Wittenberg in 1527, in which the associate pastor of the Wittenberg church lost his wife and small child. Luther's infant son, he was almost a year old at the time, nearly died. And his wife, Luther's wife, nearly died as well. She was pregnant at the time, and she did survive, and their daughter was born very small and lived for about 8 months. And Luther always blamed Elizabeth's death on how sick Catherine got while she was pregnant. And so he wrote this treatise about, for other pastors, about whether or not it was acceptable for a pastor to flee the plague when his parishioners fled the plague. Because one of the things that happened in the medieval world when a plague hit a city was if people had relatives that were in far more rural places, they scattered to the rural places and hunkered down until the plague burned itself out, and then they would go home. So sort of almost the exact opposite of what we've done, which is to shelter at home. They sort of sheltered away. And it's a pretty thoughtful piece. And I always prefaced that assignment by saying, we may never live through the bubonic plague. Hopefully we don't. But you will face a crisis in your parish at some point in time. And I talked a little bit about watching my dad pastor through AIDS. And you have to be at least my age and older to remember how terrifying AIDS was for a lot of people. He had a family in our church. I was in college by this point, but he had a family in his church who would do foster care for AIDS babies, who mostly lived about a year before they succumbed to the disease. And I grew up United Methodist, and we obviously do infant baptisms, and that family wanted those children baptized. And my dad lost probably 3 families over that, because he baptized them all. And I remember him saying to me once that the church grew by losing those 3 families. But I would talk a little bit about that. And what Luther sort of talks about there is your primary responsibility as a pastor is to your church and the care of the souls entrusted to you. That phrase is an incredibly important phrase for Luther. Seelsorge, it's the care of souls. And nothing is quite as terrifying as a pandemic that is burning its way through your community. Um, this pandemic has a death rate of about 3 to 4%, right? Um, the plague, even through the 16th century, was still running at a 20% death rate, nowhere near what it was in the 14th century. 14th century, the total death rate was about 40 to 45%, depending on the numbers that you look at. But it was a lot like this plague, in that if you were fairly young and very healthy, you survived. But in the 14th century, if you were very young, so under 3 or 4, you almost always died. And if you were old and over 45, you likely succumbed as well. So those numbers for the bubonic plague in the 14th century are very skewed. If you were over 45, you had a very small chance of surviving the plague. If you were under 4, you had a very small chance of surviving the plague. But even in the 16th century, it would kill 2 out of 10, and did the same thing. Older people, younger people, much higher mortality rate. And then he has some really practical advice for pastors in the midst of that pandemic. One is to be prepared. 2 is to care for the souls that are entrusted for you. But 3, don't be stupid. Take the precautions that need to be taken. If you're a father, and this is the first generation where you have pastors who have legitimate children, and there is and he's really funny about this. He's incredibly practical about this. He's like, if you are a younger pastor with small children, and there's an old guy in your, an older pastor whose children are grown or doesn't have children, he ought to stay and take care of the flock, and you ought to go and take care of your children. Not every pastor had to stay in Wittenberg to care for the souls of the people dying. They had to make sure that somebody stayed to care for the dying. But the rest of them, he basically says to them, go, be prudent, care for your own health as well. Now, if there's nobody there, he basically says, take up your cross and die. But if there's an old guy around who's a pretty good pastor, wave to him as you ride the cart out of town, and care for your children. And I assigned that for a long time. I had and I asked them to think about what kind of disasters might afflict your parish, and how might you think about your role as a pastor in the middle of some type of a disaster. Katrina, how do you pastor through Katrina? How do you pastor through AIDS? And then my last year at United was the year that the Mississippi was flooding at incredible levels. And one of the guys in the church, in the class, he was doing it hybrid. So we would come to United once a month and take classes, and then he was online the rest of the time. He was a pastor in one of the parishes in Louisiana that was sacrificed in order to save New Orleans at that time. I don't know if you remember this, but they blew levees north of New Orleans in order to release water out into small towns and basically just obliterate small towns in order to save the city. And he wrote me a long email in which he sort of laid out, I thought this was a stupid assignment, when you assigned it. And now that they're blowing up the levee in my town and flooding the town, the church, everyone's going to lose everything. It's bringing a fresh perspective. In terms of how Christians responded to the bubonic plague in 1348 and 49, pretty much the way people are responding now. There are some folks who, said this is God's punishment, and so we have to get right with God. And how one got right with God ran a pretty wide spectrum. Some folks looked inward and said, I have to get right with God. This is partly on me. A lot of Christians, unfortunately, looked outward in the 14th century and found the two communities that they thought were most responsible for God's wrath regarding the plague, and that were those were witches and Jews. We have a massive number of pogroms and killings of Jews in the 14th century because of the plague. And we see some of that scapegoating going on just yesterday. I mean, just yesterday we have the tweet calling it the China virus, the sort of scapegoating of another to put the blame on someone else. You had a bunch of Christians that, frankly, in the 14th century, just abandoned Christianity entirely. You see a revival in paganism tick up in the immediate aftermath of the plague, but because the medieval
good morning,
church.
ladies. How are y'all? Good to see y'all.
I'm not sure who that is.
Hey, good morning, Don. How are you?
He's having a good day, whoever he is. Everybody's muted, so I don't know who it is. I'm utterly perplexed. I forgot where I was. Oh, some people abandoned Christianity entirely because, one of the theologies that was pretty prevalent at the time was, if you are bad, God will punish you. If you are good, God will reward you. And people got right with God, supposedly, and people were still dying. And so there are a number of people who are like, well, this just isn't working. So that you do see a sort of revival in ancient, more pagan type gods come back at that point. You also have a number of folks who just sort of embrace hedonism. Drink, love, party, for tomorrow we may die. And then you have a bunch of people just trying to figure out how to pastor their way through this and survive. It's interesting, the Franciscan order, who were traveling preachers and went from place to place doing pastoral care, the death rate among Franciscans in some places bordered on 90%, partly because they were moving, but also partly because they refused to just cloister in and lock down. Benedictines, a number of Benedictine houses just shut their doors and sheltered in place, and they actually survived. Not a lot of pastoral care going on in the midst of that, but that's what they did. I think as a teacher, one of the things that this pandemic has taught me is, despite all of the modern technologies that we have, um, people have not changed remarkably. We are still doing things that are counterintuitive, that are not in our best interests. We have people following um, what my daughter calls sort of quack theories on how to fix this, which was certainly true in the medieval era. Um, but you also have people beginning to find a consensus and um, moving in directions that uh, can provide community health. It's this era that gives us the quarantine 40 days. If a city has the plague, they need to shut their gates and stay locked in for 40 days while it burns its way out. And that becomes normative after the first outbreak of the plague. Quarantine becomes a sort of normative way that you deal with uh, pandemics. So, do you have? Is that kind of what you were looking for?
Yeah, thank you, David. Yeah, great overview. This is a good time for some questions and just some discussion. So we invite everybody to chip in. But my thoughts went towards the how maybe preaching about the plague shifted people's view of God, people's theology. I know that in general, when Christianity is a majority religion, a lot of the people have a very shallow view of God and very kind of magical in a sense that, oh, he's maybe will answer my prayers, or maybe he's relevant and maybe he's not, but very superficial. But then when a disaster strikes and God isn't the magical genie in the bottle, then people's view of God must shift, in thinking of, was there a shift of the preaching or a shift in theology that happened that might be helpful to us?
I think one of the real outcomes of the 14th century, and the 14th century is a disaster, is a walking disaster from beginning to end. It's just Petrarch writes at one point in about 1350, he writes, every generation thinks they're the most cursed. We know it to be true. And it's hard to argue with him when um, the population of some German cities shrank by 80% in 2 years, which I cannot imagine. Imagine Waco with 80% fewer people walking down the streets, and then almost as soon as the plague has died itself out, England and France decide to go to war with each other that draws in all sorts of other people. There's an argument out there that says one of the implications of the plague was that it killed off all of the sort of older people, and you have very young kings in a whole bunch of places, and nobody there to sort of look at them and go, son, that's a pretty stupid idea. And they just go to war with each other at a maddeningly devastating rate. I think one of the real implications of that was a revival in preaching. we can't just preach at the people, just constantly telling them uh, what to believe and how to live, um, but preaching to them about what Christianity does offer and what Christianity doesn't offer. You also see some real beginnings of reform movements. The church is constantly looking back and trying to reform itself. When I teach the Reformation, I make sure that I tell people that this is just one, a piece of a puzzle, that Christianity is constantly trying to be better at what we do. When students sometimes, especially in 1350, how many of you went to Baylor? Anybody go to Baylor? A couple people go to Baylor. There's that freshman Christian heritage class, and they show up incredibly sincere young Christians, but with a knowledge of Christianity that's about this deep, and almost always triumphalistic. There was bad Judaism, and we came along and the Christians made it better, and just but I almost always get asked, when did the church fall? When did we stop being the perfect church? And I usually say, when Jesus picked Peter, right? Because, I love Peter because he is a traveling car wreck, right? Like, it always takes him 3 tries to get anything right. He usually ultimately will get it right, but it always takes 3 times, right? But you do see after the plague a real focused energy on the church needs to be reformed, and this is their phrase, in head and members. Where before most of the focus was top down. You have folks in Rome or folks in Paris saying, the problem with Christianity is all of those peasants down there who are not doing what we tell them to do. And after the plague, and you see a lot of folks that just didn't behave real well through the plague. You have bishops disappearing, you have abbots disappearing, you have people just abandoning communities. And I think a lot of people from below then started to say, yeah, we probably need to amend our lives, but it's pretty clear to us that you guys need to fix your show too. And we see out of that, Wycliffe comes just 20 years after the plague. Jan Hus is the generation. Jan Hus is sort of the generation that his grandparents survived the plague. And then in this sort of momentum for fixing the church in head and members really begins to build some momentum. That it's not just those of us who are on the very bottom peg need to fix what we're doing, and everything will get better. When we look up, we're not seeing stellar Christians no matter how high we go. I'm not positive I want to say that all then leads to Luther, but I think Luther is part of a continuum. of that, trying to reform and head in members to do a better job at what we're doing. You also frankly see an increase in the magic aspect of Christianity, or the transactional aspect of Christianity. If you do these 5 things, God will reward you with heaven. And you really see an explosion in indulgences, that people get very nervous about where they are going to spend eternity, and the church answers with certificates that can ensure your, I'm just looking, I thought I had some here.
Yeah, I got one right here.
You know, with an indulgence that can,
Yeah, this is from Walking the Camino de Santiago.
okay.
I earned I think perpetual heaven, I think.
Way to go. I'm still working on that one.
Yeah, so you're saying that there was kind of a divergence where in some cases the doctrine and preaching became more wholesome about what the church, what Christianity is and what Christianity isn't, and what it offers and what it does not offer. And then also there was a branch that became more sick or more weird in that it became real transactional and magical, and you know, do these 5 things. And so there was a change in doctrine, but it kind of went both ways. One was a route that went more humble, more we don't know all the answers, we don't know how to fix it, but what we do know is Jesus Christ and Him crucified. Then the other was, hey, I got all the answers, and it's in these bones of this relic of this priest that died, you know, or praying these different prayers and all that.
You do see an explosion in relics. In Wittenberg, Wittenberg had the second highest number of relics in Europe after Rome in the early 16th century. You could earn nearly 500,000 days off purgatory if you visited and prayed at every relic that was held in Wittenberg. Now, you couldn't possibly do that, right? There's too many of them and it would take you too long. But so there's certainly that aspect as well. And when I teach indulgences and the like to students, I have to work very hard to explain to them that the people selling indulgences, the people selling relics, are not used car salesmen. The used car salesman knows that there are problems with the car he's selling you. The indulgence preachers over-preached what they were selling, true, but they absolutely believe they worked. They're not selling a snake oil. They did not think that
sincere.
These things didn't work. Yeah, they were. They oversold it, but they were absolutely sincere about it. And that always interests me. It ruins me on Rome. I have a very, Rome is one of my favorite places to go. But it's very hard to visit the Vatican and as a Reformation historian and not walk through it and go, wow, so many peasants sacrificed so much for this building. It makes it so much less exciting to visit. But
yeah,
questions, concerns?
Yeah, this is y'all's time to pitch in, jump in. Things you've observed, things you want to ask.
Can I have a question?
Sure.
You said revival in preaching. So that revival is the preaching about indulgence, or did you mean something else?
No, I meant something else there. But yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's the problem. The sort of bifurcation that Tim talked about does sort of happen. So what happens is you have a focus back on the education of pastors. And in the late 14th century and then into the 15th century, we see an explosion of sort of preachers' manuals. And if you ever want to hear about that, Beth Barr is one of the leading experts in the world on that literature. And these are small booklets that were created for preachers to help elevate the level of preaching in parishes. So these were they're called exempla, example sermons that you could read for any particular day of the year. There's sort of a sample sermon printed right there, so that when you preached on a topic, now your preaching would be what we hope it will be, rather than you just telling a story that you may have heard. And I assume there's still things like that. My dad used to get little sermon illustrations tied to the lectionary, mailed to him once a month, that sort of had like nice illustrations for sermons.
Nobody here uses online sermons.
No, that's good.
Ooh,
Yeah.
yeah. So I have a question, David. So I know you said anything after the 1700 you're not concerned with, but today, of course, with the Zoom we're on here, the technology that we have, being as pastors, compared to back in the 1300s, 1400s. So I'm assuming, like this letter from Luther, the option was for a town, the priest or the pastor was there, and they could potentially have church, or if he left, there was no church. There was no way of getting out a weekly sermon, a message, or we're praying for you. And I don't know what the comparison between today and then would be like that. I mean, what is there anything to draw in that way?
So here's the really important thing. And Luther, even though we're a decade into this, right? Into the Reformation, we're 10 years or so from the 95 Theses to whether one may flee the plague. But Luther is, in a lot of ways, an incredibly conservative guy. It takes him a long time to abandon things. And so, I mean, one of the most important pastoral care responsibilities you have as a pastor in the early modern era, and this is certainly true for Roman Catholics until very, very recently, is someone should be there with you at the moment of your death. That is the moment, in some ways, in which you are in the most amount of jeopardy. And so someone needs to help guide you through the veil. And so in his era, and I assume this is probably true for some Roman Catholic priests, they have to be there. They have to go into the wards. Extreme unction is still a sacrament in the Roman tradition. And you should not, and in the medieval era, to die unshriven means to go to hell, right? That is the pastoral care concern that he's dealing with. there's no one to say, to give communion to people as they are dying. So Zoom can solve some of those problems. Zoom makes a lot of things easier especially for Protestants. And depending on where you sit on the Protestant spectrum, you can even do communion over Zoom. Now, if you're an Episcopalian, you can't do that. If you're a Roman Catholic, you can't do that. The Methodists, the thing about Methodists is we run all the way from the sort of Episcopalian end of the spectrum to the Free Church end of the spectrum. And so you've got some Methodist pastors doing communion via Zoom. Like, go find yourself some grape juice and go find yourself a piece of bread, and we'll be all good. But for Luther, somebody had to be there to hold people's hands, to pray with them as they died, to guide them through that veil. And I think that part of pastoral care is still incredibly important and incredibly difficult. My dad died on May 6th. And he was a pastor for 45 years. And we never got a chance to do a service for him at all. Because we're just absolutely shut down in May. And then, so we moved my mom to Waco a couple weeks ago, and my dad's ashes are in a small box in her apartment at the Delaney. And I don't know if we will get to do a service. And that kind of rupture, I think, was even more felt in the medieval era. If your pastor just up and walked away and half of your town died, the post-traumatic stress of that, of knowing those people probably ended up in hell because of it, there are days in which I cannot fathom the post-traumatic stress of post 1350, right? It boggles my mind sometimes. I am a huge Avengers movies fan. I have not watched either of the last two movies in that series since this began, because I'm not sure I'm emotionally prepared to watch the snap in a way that I could a year and a half ago when the last movie came out. I mean, I was not there for the very first showing, but I was there pretty quick for the last movie. And I have them, I own them, but I haven't had the ability to turn them on yet.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, David. And wow, how that your personal experience draws it all real close to home. Of we're dealing with real lives and real families and real who is God to me? Real issues of faith and life. We have just a couple minutes, maybe just to do some takeaways. I'm wondering if everybody's ready or willing to share a couple things you're taking away from this conversation that might be helpful to you, or that you have garnered as a nugget that you want to keep. Should I do a roll call? Is that the easiest way to do that? put everybody on the spot? Joe's shaking his head yes. So Joe, you can start.
Well, I think, and thank you, Tim, and certainly last week as well. What's been helpful to me is just a reminder that we're not the first ones that are going through a pandemic in the history of the world, and there are things that we can learn that are good and things that we learned that were bad in the past. And so this has been very helpful to me. And I think, at least for myself, sometimes I just feel isolated. I feel like I'm the only person, the only pastor dealing with this, but this community helps me realize I'm not. But then to learn from history helps us to realize that, 2020 is not the only time this world has experienced something like this. So yeah, that's my takeaway.
Yeah, good. Thanks. Terry Johnston.
Yeah, I'm similar with Joe. I mean, that's it is kind of comforting, reassuring. Is that the right word? To know that this isn't new, but it is new, but it isn't new. It's new to us, but it's not new to the history of God's governance of our world and God's kingdom, and how we deal with it needs to really we need to really think about it. That's what I got.
Good. David Cozart.
I was sitting here still thinking small groups and connections and sharing the burden to where it's not only on the clergy is and in a world where we are all connected and we're not to the point of having to scrounge for food. And so perspective, I think, is the word I would just give it. There are vast similarities, and there are things that are not. So,
Yeah, thank you. Billy, I think, had to leave. How about Jing Ho? What is your takeaway today?
Well, I'm still processing, but one thing that I just how do I say? Well, people haven't really changed, so our response is, I mean, it's predictable in some sense, and that's why I think learning history is helpful, and also that makes us very, very humble. I mean, our responses are very similar to the centuries ago, and people's response is also very similar. So I don't know. It's just.
Can I give one takeaway that I would like pastors to take away out of this is, especially in American Christianity, and probably far more so in American Anglo-Christianity, we have, I think one of the problems that we have tended to be preoccupied with is the theology of reward and benefit. That we find God in those places where things are going well, right? God's rewarding me for this, and God's reward is here and here and here and here. And I think, and Luther would want you to hear this, and a bunch of others would too, that a moment like this reminds the church that you don't find Jesus in the throne room, right? You find Jesus at the cross. That we find Christ in suffering. And that's probably worth remembering and revisiting in sermons. That God just isn't about. The most trouble I ever got into at Baylor was when I said something in class about I don't want to believe in a God that gives wealthy Americans parking spaces. Because one of my students talked about, she prays for a parking spot when she goes to the mall. And she just got infuriated with me. I teach Calvin, right? Like, I'm used to doing, God is in control of all things. But even Calvin would go, seriously? Really? Parking spots? You don't find Jesus in parking spots. You find Jesus in the sufferings of others. And that's probably one story that I would want us to take away from this.
Yeah, good.
Every pastor I know ought to go back and reread Moltmann, The Crucified God. If you weren't made to read The Crucified God in seminary, you ought to read it now.
Good. Have a couple more, Kenneth and Evelyn, and then Morgan.
Well, thank you, David, for that. And that's part of my takeaway as well, is that during this pandemic, it gives us all an opportunity for formation, for spiritual formation, and asking those tough questions, wrestling with fear and doubt and uncertainty, and where God is. So I'm prayerful, and my takeaway is that we continue to foster formation in our members and in ourselves as we ask difficult questions during difficult times when we don't know what lies ahead the next weeks, months, what's it going to look like. And so just really drawing near to God when we don't have all the answers.
Yeah. Amen. Evelyn, you joined us. Good to see you.
My takeaway for today, and Bishop's on as well, my takeaway from today is that I just believe that even though we're going through a pandemic, that we will come through it. And so through all of the history, it shows that we still stand. And so if we can just endure the process, if we can get through the process, we should come through it okay.
Amen. Good. Morgan, I think you're...
Yes, sir. My biggest takeaway with David today was just that moment where you mentioned, David, that when did the church stumble? When did the church fall? It was when Peter took the reins. And for myself, I felt like I've bumbled and stumbled my way through this entire process. And there's so many things I've done that I'm just like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that. And I've seen some of the uglier sides of church life during this. So I guess it's just misery loves company, I guess. I hate to say it that way, but
as long as you didn't deny Christ 3 times in a row, you're probably
good to go,
right? Right? Like,
but it's good to know that there is a track record of this very human struggle of following after God and stumbling and getting back up again. So thank you for that thought. And I also love Avengers. Very good stuff.
Well, it's been great to have everybody here today. Next week, we'll just be visiting and coming back to our normal. David, we don't always have a guest on, to bring a special topic. And so anyway, thank you so much for joining us today and bringing your thoughts and your presence to us. It was a wonderful gift today. And I think that you've encouraged and blessed each of us. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
Have a good day.
Been great to see everybody. We'll see you soon. And Lord bless everybody.
See you later.
Bye-bye, Evelyn.
Bye.